buckle up, everybody, because we're diving into some seriously intense stuff today.
Oh, intense is right.
We're talking Ezekiel chapters 25 through 32.
Oh.
Which, yeah, a lot of people skip over this section.
They do.
But trust me, it is packed with drama and intrigue.
It really is.
It's like a divine courtroom drama where God is pronouncing judgment on entire nations.
Like who?
Oh, I got a whole list.
Lay it on me.
Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia.
Oh, my goodness.
Tyre, Sidon. Even Egypt gets called to the stand.
The big dog.
The big dogs.
Wow.
It's not your typical feel-good prophecy, that's for sure.
Right.
But that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Totally.
Ezekiel, our prophet, living in exile,
Yeah.
he gets these intense visions from God. And it's like watching a historical thriller unfold.
Yeah, and what's important to remember is the context.
Okay.
These nations weren't just, political rivals to Israel.
Right.
Like just fighting over territory or resources.
Yeah.
It's more like they were that neighbor who throws a party when your house burns down and then kicks you while you're down.
Ouch. That's a rough analogy, but it kind of gets the point across.
Right.
So it's not just about conquering land or whatever.
Yeah.
It's about something much deeper.
It is.
How these nations treated Israel
Exactly.
in their moment of need.
Yeah, and God's calling them out for that.
For what, exact?
For their lack of compassion.
Okay.
Their active participation in Israel's downfall.
So God's keeping score.
He is. He's paying attention.
He sees everything.
Yeah, it really highlights that he cares about justice.
Right.
Not just for his chosen people.
But like universally.
But universally for everyone.
So he's watching how everyone's behaving.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics.
Sure.
The first group on the docket is
Who we got?
Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia.
All right, the neighbors.
Okay. So what exactly were their crimes?
Well, they all had this long history of conflict with Israel.
Right, generations of bad blood.
Generations of bad blood, exactly.
Yeah.
But it was their actions during the fall of Jerusalem that really sealed their fate.
What did they do?
Imagine you're living next door to someone
Okay.
and tragedy strikes,
Uh-huh.
like a house fire or something.
Right.
And instead of helping,
Yeah.
you celebrate.
Oh, wow.
You're happy they're suffering.
It's cold.
And you even make things worse.
Oh, my gosh.
You start looting their stuff while they're trying to escape the flames.
That's awful.
That's essentially what some of these nations did to Israel.
Seriously?
Yeah, and that's why they're in God's crosshairs.
So it's not just about what you do
It's about how you treat people,
when they're down.
especially when they're down.
Wow, that's a powerful message about compassion and empathy.
Right.
Things we often struggle with even today.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that God's idea of justice isn't limited to a specific group of people.
Okay.
He's concerned with how all nations,
Yeah.
all individuals treat one another.
It's a universal thing.
It is.
Okay, so we've covered the bad neighbors.
Yeah.
Let's move on to a different kind of case.
Right.
We're shifting from the desert to the coast,
Oh,
to the bustling port cities of Tyre and Sidon.
the big cities.
They were like the New York and London of their day, weren't they?
Yeah, think of the most bustling, opulent cities, today.
Okay,
Places dripping with wealth and influence.
got it.
That was Tyre and Sidon.
So they were doing pretty well for themselves.
Oh, yeah.
But even they weren't immune to the consequences of their actions.
Not at all.
So what happened?
Well, in chapter 26, God announces Tyre's complete destruction.
Whoa.
And the detail of this prophecy is just mind-blowing.
Okay, you got to give me some details here.
All right, so it wasn't just a vague, bad things will happen kind of prophecy.
Right.
It laid out with incredible accuracy how Tyre would be brought down.
Really?
We're talking a level of detail that almost seems impossible.
Like what?
Or remember Alexander the Great?
Yeah, of course.
He literally used the rubble of Tyre,
What?
the very stones of the city,
No way.
to build a causeway to conquer another island city.
Seriously. That is some seriously precise prophecy.
It is.
It makes you wonder if those ancient Tyrians had any clue about their city's future.
Right.
Like when they saw Alexander marching toward them.
I know. It's just incredible.
Talk about a chilling historical echo.
It really is a powerful illustration of the precision and power of God's prophetic word.
And it raises an interesting question for us.
What's that?
If God was so concerned about justice in the past,
Yeah.
Do you think he's still watching how nations act today?
Ooh, good question.
That's something to ponder.
Yeah.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Okay.
there's one more layer to this whole Tyre situation that I find absolutely fascinating.
Oh, really?
It involves the king of Tyre.
Okay.
And, well, it gets a little otherworldly.
Otherworldly.
Yeah, chapter 28.
Okay.
And the lament for the king of Tyre, it starts off seeming like it's just about a human ruler.
Right.
But it quickly takes a turn towards something much deeper.
Deeper how?
Well, some scholars believe
Yeah.
that this story about the king of Tyre
Uh-huh.
could be hinting at something even bigger.
Okay, wait.
Like a metaphor for the fall of Satan himself.
Whoa. Okay.
The description of the king's beauty,
Right.
his wisdom,
Uh-huh.
his position in the garden of God,
Yeah.
and then his downfall.
Because of pride.
Pride classic.
It all lines up with traditional understandings of Satan's rebellion.
That's interesting.
So we're talking about a text that works on multiple levels.
Okay.
A judgment on a real king.
Right.
But also a symbolic representation
Yep.
of a much larger cosmic fall from grace.
Wow, that's really cool.
It adds this whole other dimension of meaning to the prophecy.
It does.
And it really gets you thinking about the nature of pride and ambition,
Right.
both on a personal level
Yeah.
and for entire nations. You know, it's a reminder that no matter how powerful or successful you might be,
Yeah.
unchecked pride can lead to a pretty spectacular downfall.
And that's a theme we see play out again and again throughout history.
Oh, yeah.
And even in our own lives, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So it's not just ancient history.
No.
It's a timeless warning.
It really is, and it sets the stage for what's coming next.
What's next?
God's judgment on the biggest, baddest empire of them all.
Oh boy, who are we talking about?
Egypt.
Egypt, the great dragon, as Ezekiel calls it.
The big dog.
They were the superpower of the ancient world, right?
Absolutely.
Like the undisputed top dog.
Undeniably, Egypt was a dominant force for centuries,
Wow.
shaping the political and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East.
Yeah.
Their influence was vast, their wealth seemingly inexhaustible.
But they had it all.
They did.
But as with Tyre,
Oh,
their power was ultimately an illusion.
It was, and Ezekiel doesn't hold back on the details here.
Oh, really?
He uses incredibly vivid imagery
To describe?
to describe Egypt's fall.
Okay, what kind of imagery are we talking about?
Swords, blood, darkness. The whole shebang.
Wow, that's intense.
It's like watching a disaster movie unfold in slow motion.
Yikes.
But the point is clear.
What's the point?
No matter how mighty a nation may seem,
Mm-hmm.
they are ultimately subject to God's authority.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it?
It is.
Even empires like Egypt,
Yeah.
who thought they had it all figured out,
They really did.
were ultimately dependent on something bigger than themselves.
Absolutely makes you wonder.
What does it make you wonder?
What are the Niles in our own lives?
Okay, interesting.
The things we think we control,
Yeah,
but actually rely on completely.
that's a great question.
And it's one we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive into these chapters.
Okay, so stay tuned, folks, because the fall of Egypt is just the beginning.
It's easy to get caught up in the drama of these judgments.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the sheer scale of these empires, like falling apart.
Right.
But we can't forget that behind it all.
Yeah.
There's a deeper message about God's character.
That's a good point. So far, it's been a lot about God is angry and you don't want to mess with him.
Right.
But there's got to be more to it, right?
There is.
I mean, we hear all the time about God's love and mercy.
Yeah.
Where does that fit in with all this judgment?
It's a question that's puzzled people for centuries.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Even in the midst of judgment,
Uh-huh.
God never completely abandons his people.
Okay.
He continues to speak to them
Through.
through prophets like Ezekiel offering guidance and, yes, even hope.
So it's not a one-way street.
No,
It's not just God shouting down from the mountaintop, you messed up, now deal with it.
not at all. Think of it more like a parent disciplining a child.
Okay.
There's love behind the correction.
Yeah.
A desire to see them grow and learn from their mistakes.
Okay. That makes sense, but it's still hard to wrap your head around sometimes.
I know.
Especially when you read about these ancient empires being wiped off the map. How do we reconcile that with the idea of a loving God?
Well, it's important to remember that God's justice isn't about revenge
Okay.
or punishment for its own sake.
So there's a purpose behind it.
It's always about restoration,
Restoration of what?
about calling people back to a right relationship with him.
So it's not just about God flexing his muscles.
No, it's about waking people up, getting their attention,
Yeah.
and ultimately pointing them back to him.
Back to him.
Yeah, and even in these chapters where we see God's anger and power on full display,
Uh-huh.
there are these glimmers of hope,
Oh, really?
these hints that judgment isn't the end of the story.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these glimmers of hope.
All right.
Where do we see those in these chapters?
Oh, for one thing, even in the midst of judgment,
Yeah.
God continues to speak through his prophets,
Right.
offering guidance and encouragement.
Okay.
And even in the descriptions of Egypt's demise,
Uh-huh.
there are hints that this isn't the end of the story.
Can you give me an example? I'm really trying to see the silver lining here.
In chapter 32, when Ezekiel describes Egypt being cast down to the pit,
Okay.
he mentions that they will lie there alongside other fallen nations.
Right.
But then he adds this interesting detail.
What's that?
They will be uncircumcised, slain by the sword.
Okay, and what's the significance of that?
So circumcision was a sign of the covenant between God and his people.
Right, okay.
So by saying that Egypt will lie uncircumcised in the pit,
Yeah.
Ezekiel's suggesting that there's a possibility of them entering into that covenant relationship with God,
Really?
even after judgment.
Wait, so even in death, there's a chance for reconciliation?
It speaks to the boundless nature of God's mercy.
That's a powerful concept.
It's never too late to turn back to him,
Yeah.
to seek forgiveness and restoration.
And that hope isn't just for individuals, is it?
No, it's for nations as well.
That's a powerful message, especially in a world that often feels divided and broken.
It is.
It's like a reminder that even when things look bleak, there's always the possibility of a new beginning.
And that new beginning starts with each of us.
Okay.
It's about examining our own hearts, our own motivations.
Yeah.
And asking
Tell
ourselves,
ourselves what?
am I building my life on a foundation of pride and self-reliance? Or am I seeking to align myself with God's will?
It's like looking in a mirror, isn't it?
It is.
We might not be facing literal armies and collapsing empires, but the themes of pride, ambition, and the consequences of turning away from God,
Right.
that's all stuff we grapple with on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these chapters so relevant.
Yeah.
They're not just about ancient history.
It's about us,
They're about the human condition.
the human condition.
The struggle between good and evil that plays out in every generation.
So how do we apply these lessons from Ezekiel to our modern world? It's one thing to read about the downfall of ancient empires.
Right.
But how do we translate that into something meaningful for our own lives?
I think it starts with recognizing that we're not so different from those ancient civilizations.
Yeah, okay.
We might have different technology and different challenges,
Yeah.
but the human heart hasn't really changed all that much.
So we're still making the same mistakes.
We're still prone to pride, to self-reliance, to putting our trust in things that ultimately can't save us.
It's like that old saying, pride comes before the fall.
Exactly.
Whether we're talking about individuals or entire nations, history seems to bear that out time and again.
It does. And it's not just about avoiding pride in the sense of arrogance or self-importance. It's about recognizing that true strength and security come from aligning ourselves with God's will, not our own.
So it's about humility, right?
Yes.
About understanding that we're not the center of the universe.
Right.
That there's a bigger picture, a higher power at work.
Exactly. And when we lose sight of that,
Yeah.
when we start thinking we're in control,
Oh.
that's when we get in trouble.
What kind of trouble?
We make choices that lead us further and further away from God.
Right.
And ultimately, we end up facing the consequences.
And those consequences, as Ezekiel so vividly illustrates, can be pretty devastating.
They can be, but it's not a hopeless situation, is it?
No.
There's always that possibility of redemption,
Redemption.
of turning back to God and finding restoration.
Okay, so even when we mess up,
Even when we mess up.
there's still a way back.
Absolutely. And that's the message of hope that runs through these chapters.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of judgment,
God is always there.
God is always willing to forgive, to heal, to restore.
But it requires something from us, doesn't it?
It does.
What does it require?
It requires us to acknowledge our need for him,
Okay.
to humble ourselves and turn back to him.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not in this alone.
We're not.
But before we wrap up this section of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I have one more image from these chapters that I wanted to unpack.
Okay, what's that?
It's about Egypt descending into the pit, right? This idea of nations ending up in some kind of underworld.
Yes. It's a rather chilling image.
It is.
Ezekiel describes Egypt being cast down to the underworld,
Yeah.
joining all these other fallen nations in a place of darkness and despair.
So is this a literal place? Like, is there really a pit somewhere where all these nations are hanging out?
Well, it's probably best not to take it too literally,
Okay.
but the image itself is incredibly powerful.
In what way?
It speaks to the spiritual reality of being cut off from God,
Uh-huh.
of being lost in darkness and despair.
So it's more about the state of the human soul when it's turned away from God.
Exactly.
Like a spiritual death.
And it's a reminder that this kind of spiritual death is far more terrifying than any physical death.
Wow.
It's about losing your connection to the source of life, to the light and love that sustains us.
That's some heavy stuff to ponder.
It is.
And it makes the whole idea of judgment and restoration take on a whole new dimension.
It does.
But I feel like we've only scratched the surface of these chapters. There's so much more to explore, so much to unpack.
There is, and that's the beauty of studying Scripture.
Yeah.
It's a journey of discovery, a process of uncovering layer upon layer of meaning.
So the more we delve into these ancient texts,
Yeah.
the more we discover their relevance for our own lives.
Absolutely.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
what's the one key takeaway you want listeners to carry with them?
I think the most important thing to remember is that we are not just passive observers of history.
Okay.
We are active participants in God's unfolding story.
We are.
And the choices we make both individually and collectively have eternal consequences.
So it's not just about learning about ancient empires and their downfall.
No.
It's about learning from their mistakes and choosing a different path for ourselves.
Exactly. Ezekiel's message is a call to humility.
Yeah.
A reminder that true strength comes from aligning ourselves with God's will, not our own.
Right.
It's a call to repentance, a call to turn away from our destructive paths and embrace the God who loves us and desires our restoration.
Powerful stuff, and a great reminder that even in the midst of judgment, there's always hope.
Always.
But before we wrap up this section of our deep dive, I have one more question.
Okay, shoot.
We've talked about the consequences of turning away from God,
Right.
but what about the flip side?
What about it?
What happens when nations or even individuals choose to follow God's path? Is there a reward, a blessing?
That's a great question.
What does that look like?
And it's one that takes us right into the heart of Ezekiel's message of hope and restoration.
Okay.
We'll explore that in more detail as we continue our deep dive in the final part.
Ooh, another cliffhanger.
I keep them coming back.
Our listeners are going to be on the edge of their seats. Okay, so last time we were talking about the consequences of turning away from God.
Right, all that judgment stuff.
Yeah, but we ended on kind of a cliffhanger.
We did.
What happens when we choose to align ourselves with God's will?
The flip side.
Is there like a reward, a blessing?
Oh, there absolutely is.
What does that look like?
Well, it's like trading a crumbling, unstable foundation for sour
to the
screen.
ground. Okay, I like that analogy.
When nations and individuals embrace God's principles,
Like what kind of principles?
justice, compassion, humility,
Yeah,
it's not just about avoiding punishment.
right.
It's about building something truly lasting and good.
So it's not just about fire and brimstone.
No.
It's about flourishing,
Exactly.
about creating a society where things actually work well.
Think about it.
Okay, I'm thinking.
When people act justly, trust flourishes.
That makes sense.
When leaders are humble, they make wiser decisions.
Yeah.
When compassion guides our actions, communities become stronger.
So it's like a ripple effect.
It is. It's not some pie-in-the-sky ideal.
Right.
It's a recipe for a thriving society.
It makes you wonder,
Why?
if those ancient nations had listened to Ezekiel,
Yeah.
could they have avoided their downfall?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah. Could they have experienced that kind of flourishing?
We can only speculate, but what we can learn from their mistakes is this.
What?
Turning away from God ultimately leads to destruction,
Right.
while embracing his principles leads to life both individually and collectively.
So it's not just about avoiding the pit.
Right.
It's about building a society that reflects God's goodness.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier that even within these judgments on Egypt,
Yeah.
there are hints of restoration.
There are.
Can you expand on that a bit?
Absolutely. Remember that detail about Egypt lying uncircumcised in the pit.
Yeah.
It suggests that even after judgment, there's a possibility of entering into a covenant relationship with God.
So even after messing up,
Even then,
there's still a chance.
it speaks to the boundless nature of God's mercy.
It's never too late
It's never too late to turn back to him,
to turn back to you.
to seek forgiveness and restoration.
And that hope isn't just for individuals, right?
It's for nations as well.
That's a powerful message, especially in a world that often feels so divided and broken.
It is.
It's like a reminder that even when things look bleak,
Yeah.
there's always the possibility of a new beginning.
And that new beginning starts with each of us.
With each of us.
It's about examining our own charts,
Our own?
our own motivations, and asking ourselves,
Seeing ourselves what?
am I building my life on a foundation of pride and self-reliance, or am I seeking to align myself with God's will?
So it's not just about reading these ancient prophecies and
Yeah.
saying, wow, those guys really messed up.
Nope.
It's about looking inward
It is.
and asking,